I'm CW2 John Blair with Charlie Company 3rd to 238th. You're my grandfather, Major General retired John Blair. And today we're going over, we already discussed, we're going over the purpose of this interview is for compiling a list of the unit's history, aviation in the state of New Hampshire. And so thank you for participating in this. It's going to be a huge resource for us. I mean, that's 35 years of Army aviation in the state.
Yeah, I think it's a great project.
Ask how did you get into aviation? How did you end up in the Army? And
I went to University of New Hampshire.
Okay.
I was in Army ROTC, and I took it used to be ASVAB, aviation.
Yep.
I took whatever the test was, and lo and behold, I did really well. I don't know why. I had no aspirations before that. And so they got me so they said, would you like to, here I had a choice, would you like to go learn to fly out at Skyhaven and get your private license? And then they had a 4-year active duty commitment after that. Or would you like to march every Friday? You know, we used to have marching and drilling ceremonies every Friday or once a week. And then I said, well, let me try this flying. And I really loved it.
Cool.
That's the way it started.
So you started at Skyhaven Airport flying?
I flew at Skyhaven flying a 172.
Yeah.
Got my private pilot's license. And we also had, it was a approved school, approved flight school, so I only needed 35 hours to get a license. But we had classes before 7 o'clock in the morning. We would have ground school, and there was one of the professors was licensed as a ground school instructor, and so it became it was an approved flight school. So I got my license at 35, and then I could use the other 5 hours to take my family up and stuff.
Nice.
Scared the hell out of your grandmother.
I'd imagine so.
You know, you do a dumb thing like, she didn't know what a stall was, and I said, all right, let me show you this. Now she'd never fly with me.
After the
Okay, Colonel Tilton retired. He had a medical problem. He retired, and I became the facility commander. I was a facility commander, and the state aviation officer. And then I went after I was a state aviation officer. I became the supply management officer, assistant USPFO, and then the USPFO. And I was able to. They had a thing called limited cockpit duty. And I was able to continue flying, and I was flying in our U-21. That was my last flight was my qualification, the U-21, and then they just wouldn't let us anymore fly, wouldn't let 06s fly anymore. So I had to quit.
UNH.
I graduated from UNH. I went down to Fort Sam Houston because I was Medical Service Corps officer. I went from there to Fort Walters to flight school.
What year would have that been?
Well, it was, let's see, it was Thanksgiving Day. I was driving up to Fort Walters, so it was the day after Thanksgiving in 1966. November 65 or 66, something like that. I graduated in 66 from UNH. So that was June. Yeah, that was 66. I started flight school.
Yeah, cool.
So when you were selected as a medical service officer, did you know that you were going to be a medevac pilot, or could you have ended up just being a regular medical
I had
service
another
officer?
interview one time, and the guy says, did you volunteer for Vietnam? And I said, well, I was a medical service corps officer, and there were 200 of us, and 100 were in Vietnam. I kind of knew where I was going. So, no. Yeah, I knew I was going to Vietnam, but I didn't volunteer.
Well, did you so how did it work? Like with Jake, like he got done like his last year at UNH and then found out his branch.
Yeah.
Did like when you first started flying at Skyhaven, did you already know that you were going to be going aviation? Like was that?
Yeah,
kind of
I knew my branch.
That was okay. So like that was initially
Yeah.
with your ROTC
I,
program.
so, yeah,
Okay.
and so I knew I was going to be a medevac pilot, and that's why I went to Fort Sam in the beginning. It was a basic officer branch school. Went to flight school, and I came back to Fort Sam, Houston, to the 507th Medical Company, and there I flew H-19s. I flew a Sikorsky like you.
Yeah.
Nice.
But my Sikorsky was a H-19, and so we practiced aeromedical evacuation in the H-19, and you could maybe get 2 people on a running takeoff in the air.
Yeah.
And so we practiced it with the H-19 for medevac, and then got 1 hour of Huey time. We had 1 Huey and a bunch of H-19s, and the lieutenants and warrant officers got to fly 1 hour before deploying, so you'd be current when you get to your unit. So,
So did you fly Hueys in flight school, or were you?
yeah, we flew.
Okay.
Yeah, there's another interesting thing, how things change. You went to school for, the Army at the time had the A, B, Charlie, the C, the gunship, and the D. And you studied all of them in ground school. Well, one time, never flown the D model in my life, and that was my assigned aircraft for the day, with 2 students going solo. I mean, we qualified. I probably took my check ride in the B, and then, you'd end up flying the C and the D, and no transition.
Just figure it out.
Yeah, you say, like when we got into a C, I can remember this clearly. Got into a C, a low Army airfield, and we get in there. You ever fly one of these? No. You? I said no. Said, okay, let's see, what will you remember? Okay, and a hydraulic off, you had 3 pulls, you had 3 movements of the collective, if you had an engine failure. And if you had a hydraulic failure, it was totally different from all the other aircraft, and at least we reviewed what we had in ground school before we flew it. Took off and had a period in the C model with no transition. D model, same thing.
So did you deploy?
Yes.
You did. Okay.
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
But
And his dad was born 2 weeks before I left.
Yeah, wow. And what year would that have been? That you deployed?
67, wasn't it?
He was born in
yeah, I was-
68.
Huh? He was born in 68? Okay.
January 68, yeah.
January 68. And I assume you were in Vietnam a full year, so probably 68 all the way till January 69.
Yeah.
And then you said you left active duty the year later. Would have been January.
Yeah,
7.
I went down back to
Yeah.
Fort Stewart, and then I joined the New Hampshire Guard. I saw in the Quad A magazine that there was a medical unit in Concord, New Hampshire. So I called them up
Okay.
and said, geez, Medevac pilot help. Got any spaces for me? And like I said, they had Joe Breton, Bob Patrick, and me and the other fixed wing pilots.
Wow. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Huh. It's neat.
So for the early history and formation, we already kind of started discussing it, but could you kind of discuss the early years of Army aviation once you showed up to the unit in '70? What kind of
At Fort
aircraft?
Stewart were the fixed wing school and Cobra training. Cobras were out of Hunter. Bird dogs were at Fort Stewart, and I was chief of the helicopter ambulance rescue for Fort Stewart, or Flatiron. Then I came here. Is that?
Yeah. So did
Yes,
those
yes,
fixed
question.
wings, did those convert over into that medical company, or did they stay kind of?
Yeah, they were part of the
Yeah.
medical company because people like I told you, like Colonel became Colonel Scott. Dick Hawley, Colonel Hawley was the commander when I came here of the medical detachment after they converted, and he and about 4 other people were the fixed wing pilots. We had 2 Air Force, believe it or not, Air Force Beaver and 1 Army Beaver, the one that I gave you the photographs of. And so my first ride in a New Hampshire National Guard was in a Beaver aircraft. I wasn't qualified in the 23, so my first couple drills, I was the flight operations officer, but no experience in either of the, well, I had 23 as primary helicopter school, but I hadn't flown it in 4.5 years or so. And so that's how I ended up getting into the unit.
So in those early years with the 23s and the Beavers, did you guys participate in any of the state rescue missions at that time?
Believe it or not, we still did, but you know, we were limited to ambulatory and search and rescue. Search,
Yeah.
mostly search. We could take somebody with a sprained ankle and pick them off
Yeah.
the top of the mountain, but it was kind of tough to lift them up by a rope in the 23.
So initially, after they created that medical company, did they start transitioning you to the 58s and the
Yeah,
2H1s?
yeah. Well, we ended up filling up quite a few 23Ds before, and we went down to the 1 Beaver, the one 72570 there, that I have the photograph of. And then we transitioned, I think, boy, it doesn't matter, but then we started transitioning into we got a couple Hueys, and we got 58s. The 58s went to the artillery. They were part of the 197th, and the Hueys were part of the 397th.
Okay. Were you all co-located?
Right
Those
here,
are over,
yeah,
yeah.
right. The part that's the auditorium, mess hall, and building 1 was our hangar. That was our whole hangar. When I joined, and when I got hired as a flight instructor. That hangar had an office that was 100 square feet, and in that office was Colonel Tilton. He was the facility commander, state aviation officer. Frank Sikoskis was the maintenance supervisor. Don Ducharme was the flight operations specialist. And when I got hired, we kind of hot bunked Colonel Tilton's office. I had a desk when he left, And when he came in, I got out, sat at the chair, and then finally I got a cubicle out in the hangar floor, and got a cubicle on the hangar floor, and every time they opened the door to move the aircraft in the winter, I had to get up and go in the other place because the only heated, well, that, the bathroom and supply were the only heated rooms in the building. But
Do you remember what year it was when the Hueys and the 58s arrived?
well, it
Would that
was,
be right?
right,
Okay.
right, mid-70s, early 70s.
Okay.
And
So how did it work for transitioning to aircraft locally? Did you?
well, locally for me, I transitioned into the 23. I transitioned to 23 right off, and let's see, I joined in July, and I think in August we went to AT, and I was able to transition before AT to go to Fort Drum,
Yeah.
where we had to refuel at Keene. Let's see, we refueled at Keene and Rome, New York to get to Fort Drum, New York.
So where you typically did most of your ATs in the early years? Over
Excuse
Drum?
me?
Is that where you did most of your ATs in the early years over at Drum?
Yes,
Yeah.
totally. You know?
And those early years with the Bird Dogs and the Beavers and the 23s, any notable events with those airframes prior to moving into the 58s and the UH-1s again?
No. Now, I was never here when the Bird Dogs were
Oh,
here. There were a couple stories. One of our colonels, well, became a colonel, had a forced landing on the interstate. That made the paper somewhere. You could probably find that in the Concord Monitor.
About when was that, sir?
It was before 70, before I
Okay.
got here. But I think that was, oh God, he became the brigade commander even.
Because I wanted to 93 open, we can probably get some math of 70 and, because it wasn't that long of a stretch
Sure,
before
yeah.
93 was actually built, probably,
I
right?
want to say it's like mid-50s, it was here in Concord.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
Anyway.
do some digging.
Yeah.
Eights and the UH-1s build
Oh,
more
boy.
force structure, more people.
Yeah, we
more-
thought, don't compare it to the Black Hawk, but that was getting back into the technology I was used to, and it was more useful for training.
Mhm.
It was totally more useful for training. It was what the active component was using, and we were using it, and then we could really get into medical evacuation, both rescue and training
Mhm.
for the medical mission.
And were all of your aviators typically qualified on all the airframes that you had?
No, they were to get qualified in the aircraft of assignment.
Mhm.
Being a flight instructor, I was already I went off to 58 flight IP course down at Fort Rucker, and then I transitioned fixed wing locally because I had a commercial airplane and instrument ticket, and at the time you could transition locally, so I transitioned into the 72570 Beaver locally.
Yep.
And then I went to Fort Rucker when we got the T-42, and I went to Fort Rucker and got my fixed wing instructor pilot course. Yeah, but the field artillery didn't have a unit until they modernized and they got their new MTO&E, and they included 6 Jet Rangers. We got
Oh, they had 6.
6 Jet Rangers and 6 Hueys.
How long did they have the Jet Rangers for?
You got me. I don't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they got rid of those before the Blackhawks can't
Oh,
remember.
yeah, they were all, the Hueys, I think, were the last thing
Yeah.
to leave. And what was neat is all of our Jet Rangers we picked up at the factory, brand new,
Wow.
out of Saginaw, Texas.
Which unit had the Jet Rangers?
The Field Artillery Group,
The
197.
197?
And was that the artillery spotting mission or?
That's right,
Okay.
that's right.
Do you know, General, when our 172nd deployed to Vietnam, did they bring air assets with them too?
No, oh no.
No? Just
No,
guns?
they didn't have them at the time,
Okay.
no. And that was before I
Right.
joined.
Did the
But there was
previous,
still many of the people that were in the unit then, that stayed in the unit,
Okay.
yeah.
did the pre-
Some nitty-gritty nerd stuff, sir. Looking through, I've got Bruce Hardy's, I've only got his first binder here, his list of everyone that's come through our unit. Mr. Jocks has effectively re-digitized this. He put it all in an Excel sheet.
Uh-huh.
And there's a couple of units, and they may be before your time, that have shown up in the notes. And I was wondering if you had heard of them or could shed any light on them. We had a 2-corps,
What?
a 2-corps of artillery aviation detachment. We had a couple people, but only a handful in that. There was a first of the 172nd Field Artillery Battalion Aviation.
Yeah, yes.
And it sounds like that one was concurrent with, or, no, it was 197th at the 58th?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. 29th Aviation Company, that's part of the lineage, like the Army's lineage
Yeah.
of 1159th.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
397th, then the 1159th.
Right. And it looks like we were 29th Aviation Company here in New Hampshire for 2 years, from December of 67 to July of 69.
Yeah, and that was, it was split company with Hawaii.
That's, okay, yeah.
Oh.
Interesting.
Boy, some
Lot
of
of
that
training
old-
opportunities.
Some of that old, huh?
a lot of training opportunities with them?
Yeah.
And you said that was a fixed wing unit, sir?
That's what?
That was a fixed wing unit?
Yes, it was.
29th?
It was an aviation company, fixed wing.
Would that have been bird dogs and beavers?
I've got a picture of Colonel Hawley with, and he's standing next to a bird dog. So I'm not. That was when I saw that picture. It was the first time I realized that New Hampshire had bird dog. in it.
Okay.
I mean,
Mr. Jocks also found I'll run up to my office and print one. He found some pictures of Building M under construction. Our hangar, now Building 1,
Yeah.
is up.
yeah.
And on the ramp, there's a handful of bird dogs and beavers.
Oh, is there? Fantastic.
I think if we like look back at construction records of like, well, what year was Building M built? Like we could figure out when we had those airframes. But it was the old ramp.
Yeah, I got a picture of our flight operations, which was a trailer. That was if the stage at that that wall
Yeah.
of the hangar. Just on the other side of that, we had our flight operations was a trailer, and I've got a picture of that.
Okay.
Do we know what year roughly that building was actually built, the flight facility?
Excuse me?
Do you know when that flight facility was built, by chance? No.
Yeah, I was there,
Yeah.
but when you're living it, you don't say, "Oh, this
Yeah, of
was
course.
what
Yeah, yeah.
what year it was."
Yeah, yeah.
At that point, once you guys transitioned to the 58s and the UH-1s, were there any notable moments from those years? Any disaster responses, significant search and rescue missions that you participated in?
Well, we had one total aircraft crash once when I was the commander of the 397th.
Was that the power lines?
No. Oh, that was a 5th Jet Ranger.
Yeah.
The power line was Colonel Tilton, the state aviation officer, ran the power lines up on Connecticut River and went into the water. They all got out safely, and,
Yeah.
and we recovered the aircraft. But the crash I started talking about was Skip Anderson.
I actually just met him. He was in here a few weeks
Huh?
ago.
Was he?
Yeah.
Okay, Skip was the pilot in command, and I don't know if any of you remember Margie Arwine. She worked in personnel.
Oh, actually, that name sounds familiar.
Okay,
Yes,
and
yeah.
she's since retired.
Yeah, right.
Okay, Margie came. She had been in the Army, but she came as a secretary to facility commander,
Okay.
and I hired her as a secretary, and then she joined the Guard after that. And I promised her, and she said, "I'm afraid of flying," and I promised her that she would not have to fly, that the job that she was getting hired for did not require her to fly. And then Mr. Anderson, who was our maintenance officer, had I think it was, I don't know if it was a transition, something I think it was something in either the engine or the transmission or where they come together that failed. And he had a forced landing in the trees at Fort Drum. And getting back to Margie Arwine, this was about a week after I hired her. I said, "Margie, we need a stenographer of the Accident Investigation Board," and she was I think she was qualified as a court stenographer, so she would have been perfect for it. And I said, "Could I ask you to help us?" And she did. And so she went out, and the accident. This is the thing that teased me off. They called it a maintenance failure. Yet it was a new aircraft, and we never worked on the part that failed. It was an error in either it was a new aircraft to us that had been rebuilt, and I think we flew it back from Corpus Christi, Texas. But we only had it for a while, and whatever was the failure part, they said was due to maintenance. I didn't like that too much.
I've got my notes here from Skip Anderson. Just
Hoist and Hueys?
Oh, yes, yeah, we had.
Always had probably a pretty good
Well,
hoist program over the years.
Yeah, well, if you notice, there's a plaque on the building here for Specialist Bartlett. He was our tech inspector. And there was an accident up in Lebanon. Guy was flying the VOR approach at Lebanon and went outside the 10-mile circle and descended.
Yep.
Went right into the side of the mountain.
Yep.
Like they said you would if you didn't stay in the 10-mile
Right.
circle. And anyways, so we went up there and we saw there was one guy. Everybody on the crew was killed except there was one guy we could see leaning against a tree, just all, bloody. And Colonel Tilton had studied and had an EMT qualification. And so we went over to Lebanon, got a rope. Colonel Tilton, I hovered the aircraft. Colonel Tilton went down the rope. Steve Bartlett went down, fell off the rope, and hit the back of his head, and was killed in a rescue. And after that, we get the hoist, which was a whole lot more effective.
Right.
Was using the aircraft with the rope kind of a standard before?
We used it in Vietnam.
Yeah.
We used it in Vietnam to get a medic on the ground, especially like special forces.
Yeah.
When they get out, they wouldn't have the treatment, and then so we could drop a medic on the rope. And it wasn't very high. It wasn't more than 15 feet, 10, 15 feet.
Yeah.
But the way he landed, it was,
Yeah.
what he did is he kind of pushed off, but the skid swung under, and then so that's why he hit the back of his head.
Involved were you guys with the local population and local agencies? Like, I know we had a relationship with Fish and Game, and
Yeah, we've always had a relationship with the Fish and Game and the Forestry Service.
Did you guys work with Forestry Service solely for search and rescue kind of missions, or did you work with them in any other capacity?
No, there were times when you'd have forest fires or threats of forest. Or somebody would say they saw something that looked like smoke, and we'd take a forest ranger, not a forest ranger, but forestry person up. And the forestry used to have a beaver. They used to have a beaver on floats.
Yeah.
But they'd go with us in our little 23s because they couldn't afford to run the beaver. Don't put that down.
Did you guys have any sort of firefighting capability with the UH-1s?
Oh yeah, we had the
Bambi
Bambi
bucket?
bucket.
Okay.
And we used the Bambi bucket, and yeah, that's about that. That was the only thing, and it was not a very big one either.
Yeah, I've seen them from the JBI aircraft.
Yeah.
We might still have it down in cold storage.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's right.
Do you have any particularly any more memorable missions on the state rescue side, firefighting, anything along those lines?
Well, yeah, we used to pick up somebody every year at Tuckerman's Ravine, and spring skiing was,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, we're flying about a
Crazy.
dozen or so missions per year with Fish and Game.
yeah,
Is that kind of similar to what you guys were, or more so?
right.
Yeah.
And we got that picture of Frank Leith. He was a facility commander after I was, a couple after. After I was, John Wheaton was, and then Frank Leith. And you get that picture of him with the toes of his skids on the mountain.
Yeah.
This is an interesting one. We had a rescue north, well, you know where Milan Airport is, and to the east is the Ridge Line. And the tops of those were in the 4,000 foot range, And it was a clear night, and it was picking up an ambulatory, so it had a Jet Ranger. And took off from the top of that mountain and went and going down. I was going to go to the Milan Airport that was just close by, and the whole windscreen fogged up because the temperature changed.
Oh, jeez, yeah.
There was a temperature inversion. Had you heard this one before?
No,
Yeah.
Jeremy's got a very similar story.
Something happened with the
And
bottom also.
if you've ever flown in the Jet Ranger, you can't reach the windscreen. There's nothing you can do.
Sure.
And so we were instruments until the heater would get warm and we could
Jeez, wow.
defrost the windshield and land. But the little tiny attitude indicator worked. I told you about George LeBerry being one of our fixed-wing pilots. He was a World War II Air Force pilot, joined the Army Guard, and his son, Scott LeBerry, was one of our rotary wing pilots. And so I asked Scott if he's got some of his father's old photographs and pictures, and he's going to go through some of them. He does have some, so I'll have more stuff coming in.
That'd be perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. Awesome.
How did you see training for your aviators and air crews evolve from the Vietnam era up through, I mean, as the adjutant general, you saw the level of preparedness going into the
Well,
war on terror?
the training got more structured and the records. Being the state aviation officer, before I was that, I was the flight operations officer at the hangar, and the kind of records that we had to keep, the training records really, it used to be just your flight records. You get qualified and you kept current, and you did your unit missions with your unit, but the records really have increased as far as training records, and it's for the best. I mean, there was no more faking it or ignoring it.
What did you guys have for hour requirements for your guard guys?
We had, for part-timers, we had 40 hours a year. Instrument ride and a stand ride.
Mm-hmm.
And then the units had their own training requirements.
Was that typical that your guard guys would fly around what they were required to, or was there more ample opportunity to?
Well, there was more than most people. A lot got more than the 40, but that's all. And we get 24 FTPs.
Yeah.
And if I don't know, are FTPs counted for retirement points anymore?
They are. Yeah.
Are they? They weren't. So you flew your 24 FTPs, and it was for pay.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're not mercenaries, but I think it's fairer now. I mean, when you have all of the requirements, the same, readiness levels as active component. I mean, why shouldn't you get paid for it?
Mm-hmm.
So, I think it's fair. At the very beginning,
Yes, sir.
I would take somebody up for a ride. We go up, take a crew chief, crew member. We didn't have crew chiefs that were flying crew chiefs. They weren't. We had people that were assigned as crew chiefs, but we didn't have Hueys. They were, and so we'd take them up, some flying. But we would, do our required. Couldn't fly instruments, so you would just, VFR, day and night VFR, just fulfill your crew requirements. Take somebody along.
How many personnel did you guys have for your typical drill week?
Well, we had the full unit, the
Yeah.
50, was it 4 people in the medical detachment, I think, and so we had all the enlisted.